massive protests in Washington, D.C. Protesters storm the Capitol. What is going on? Welcome to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. Remember a few days ago when we all thought, thank goodness 2020 is finally over? Well, the joke is on all of us, because 2021 is somehow already worse. Yesterday, January 6th, was supposed to be the day Congress certified the results of the Electoral College, which officially confirms who the next president will be. And while it may have started out that way, the news is dominated by this.
We are now just 5 minutes away from a curfew in our nation's capital, following a day in which a mob has stormed our nation's capital and inflamed all by angry Trump speech earlier in the day and his supporters.
A few weeks ago, President Trump invited his supporters to protest in D.C. and said it would be wild. I don't think he predicted this guy. But what actually happened in Washington, D.C. on January 6th? The truth is, there's still a lot we don't know. We recorded this episode on the evening of January 6th, but it's going to take days before we really know what happened. A few things we can say, though. One, there were huge crowds of pro-Trump supporters in Washington during the day. They had gathered for a rally ahead of Congress's meeting to certify the Electoral College votes. 2, at some point after the crowd marched to Capitol Hill, a smaller group of people forced their way into the Capitol building, despite police trying to stop them. 3, Congress postponed their debate and evacuated the Capitol building. But the way you interpret Wednesday's events, well, that depends on your political view and which media you're watching. NBC called it an insurrection that forced an evacuation and lockdown, whereas One American News Network called it simply protests. Now, I wasn't there personally, but it can be helpful to at least see some of the footage from the Capitol. Here's the moment that the protesters breached the barriers in front of the Capitol building, according to a reporter for The Blaze who took this video. The police don't seem to be expecting that. And the police tried to stop them with tear gas and pepper spray. The crowd shoves into the building past police officers. But then, once they get into the Capitol building, there's also footage like this, which looks less like an insurrection and more like a guided tour. And inside the Senate chamber, it looked like this, which is even less interesting than watching the Senate in session. And then there was this guy, which I don't think I'll ever understand. So it was complicated. Eventually, the police got reinforcements and protesters were cleared from the building. Unfortunately, one woman was shot and killed. What that headline doesn't say is that she was shot by law enforcement. The protesters didn't appear to be carrying guns. There's also a big contrast in how this protest was covered versus the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020. Remember back when AOC said that the whole point of protesting is to make people uncomfortable? And remember when CNN host Chris Cuomo said this?
Show me where it says that protests are supposed to be polite and peaceful.
And remember when Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler repeatedly said no to the federal government sending the National Guard, even after protesters breached the Portland Federal Courthouse and damaged federal property? In Washington, D.C. yesterday, at the Democratic mayor's request, the White House mobilized the National Guard and the FBI within a few hours. Of course, a big difference is that in the examples I just mentioned, those people saw the BLM protests as justified. These election fraud protests, not so much. Here's CNN's coverage of yesterday's events.
It's not funny. It is part of, you can call it sedition, you can call it a protest well beyond the line. It's illegal. It's illegal is what it is.
Compare that to CNN's coverage of the fiery but mostly peaceful Black Lives Matter protests last summer.
The common theme that ties all of this together is an expression of anger and frustration over what people feel like has become an all too familiar story.
Well, among Trump supporters, there's also a lot of anger and frustration at what they see as an election that was stolen through large-scale fraud. And they point out that most of them were not storming the Capitol.
You know, the folks that we talked to would make the point that they said, look, we're the good Midwestern folks who feel like we haven't been heard, they're hoping their message was heard today, and they wanted. I was talking to a woman actually right about here, right before the police got here, and she was questioning who the bad actors were that actually went into the Capitol, who that mob was, because she said that doesn't sound like Trump supporters, and she was shaking her head at it too.
So maybe 2021 is like the opposite of 2020, because now Republicans are like, they're mostly peaceful protesters, and Democrats are like, send in the National Guard. Basically, some people just want to believe that their side is the good side, and it's the other side that needs to be stopped. And it's also hard for people to accept that their own side crossed a line. It's easier to believe it was a few bad actors from the other side. Like how after this guy stormed the Capitol, some conservatives were like, he's not one of us, he's Antifa. And then they pointed to this photo of him at a Black Lives Matter protest in Tempe, Arizona. But if you look at the entire photo, he's holding a QAnon sign. He wasn't there to join the BLM protest. So he's not Antifa. He's a 32-year-old Trump supporter named Jake. But regardless of who started it, the breaking into the Capitol will color everyone's perceptions of the overall protest, which was mostly peaceful. Just like the looting and rioting over the summer colored people's perceptions of the initial BLM protests, which were mostly peaceful. Meanwhile, as protesters were inside the Capitol, Trump gave this video message over Twitter.
You have to go home now. We have to have peace. We have to have law and order.
Trump supporters took it to heart. At least the ones who saw it did, because Twitter later removed the video. That may have been because Trump also repeatedly talked about election fraud in the video. Twitter also removed another tweet from Trump that was also about election fraud and told people to go home with love and peace. And then Twitter locked Trump's account for 12 hours, threatening to permanently suspend him. Look, I understand what Twitter is trying to do. They think that letting Trump tweet about election fraud incites his supporters to more riots. So of course, if they delete Trump's tweets and threaten to suspend his account, that'll fix the problem. I'm sure his supporters don't feel like they're being silenced at all. Meanwhile, this was Joe Biden's response to Wednesday's events.
It's not protest, it's insurrection.
But then he said, come on, man, it's time to unify.
Let me be very clear. The scenes of chaos at the Capitol do not reflect a true America, do not represent who we are. What we're seeing are a small number of extremists dedicated to lawlessness. I remain optimistic about the incredible opportunities. There has never been anything we can't do when we do it together.
Which is a pretty reasonable message, actually. How's that unity and togetherness coming along? Well, Democratic Congresswoman Cori Bush is blaming Republican members of Congress for inciting a domestic terror attack. She's even drawn up this resolution to expel them from office. Looks like she drafted it ahead of time. It's dated January 5th. So for some people, the way a small number of Trump supporters behaved on Wednesday is a great opportunity to paint all Trump supporters in the same light. And meanwhile, other lawmakers are calling for Trump to be impeached again. Yeah, it looks like 2021 is going to be a lot of fun. I don't know what that means yet, except that if you didn't win 2020 disaster bingo, you'll probably have another chance for 2021. And as I mentioned earlier, there are still a lot of things we don't know about what happened on Wednesday. And we may never know some things, like why Jake came shirtless in 40-degree weather. But the good news is, the protests in Washington, D.C. are over, at least for now. And Congress will reconvene to certify the electoral vote sometime after I recorded this episode Wednesday night. So, that's coverage for another day. Another very long day. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.